Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the first panel of the afternoon. My name's Bryn Hatton. I teach art history here at Williams, and it's my honor today to introduce this panel, one which, if my sneak preview of its contents are a good indication, I think will speak quite resonantly with Dr. Zorach's opening comments, specifically about the art of losing. So our two panelists today, the first of whom I'm going to introduce now, both address themes of conflict and sometimes failure in contemporary art practice and its interface with issues of the ecology, the environment, and its terrains. So our first panelist, Dr. James Nisbet, he is Associate Professor of Art History at the University of California, Irvine. He's the author of the book, Ecologies, Environments and Energy Systems in the Art of the 1960s and 70s, which was published in 2014 by the MIT Press. And his talk today will be on Richard Serra's work, Shift. The paper is entitled The Ecological Site. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nisbet.
Well, thanks to Bryn for the kind introduction. Today I'll be speaking about an artwork shift that I've been thinking about for a number of years. What follows is an attempt to finally address this piece head-on, an approach that I'd like to note was spurred in many ways by a lecture invitation from my fellow conference speaker, Maggie Chow, a few years ago, and the conversation that followed from it. Thanks as well to Trina McKeever, Richard Serra's archivist, and to the photographer Eamon McMahon, who separately provided many of the images for this talk. I'd also be remiss if I didn't say that as an alum of the grad program here, it's a real pleasure to be back in Williamstown. My sincere thanks to Christopher and Rebecca for the invitation. Before us is a photograph by Gianfranco Gorgoni, the go-to documentarian for the American post-war land artists, showing a site-specific sculpture completed by Richard Serra in 1972 on farmland just north of Toronto, Ontario. Looking in places more like an abstract print or drawing than a documentary photograph, this image presents the 6 low-lying concrete walls of Serra's sculpture in a stark, snow-covered landscape, marked by the meandering tracks of a few ambulatory viewers, one of whom, right here, we can make out standing in a bulbous winter jacket, like a small ink blot darting the stark environment, at the end of a single faint line of footprints terminating in the gap between the drop of the farmost wall from Gorgoni's camera and the slow rise of the wall emerging from the ground beside it. Heavily exposed shadow cast by the walls of Shift cut through this landscape, melding the concrete and shaded snow into a series of heavy black wedges that seemed to pierce the surface of the land, unless provided the bare traces of orientation afforded by details such as the tree branches that appear scratched into the lower right corner of the photograph, or hints of daylight breaking through the stand of trees across the upper edge. This composition might read as entirely unmoored from a living environment. Indeed, this and related modes of abstraction have both troubled the reception of this work and limited its impact on discussions about ecology and art from the late 20th century and beyond. Topics that I will consider in this paper partly as an argument about Shift, and partly as a methodological argument staged through this site-specific sculpture. Shift was created out of a shared experience of walking between Serra and the artist Joan Jonas. As Serra explains, in the summer of 1970, Joan and I spent 5 days walking the place. We discovered that 2 people walking the distance of the field opposite one another, attempting to keep each other in view despite the curvature of the land, would mutually determine a topological definition of the space. The boundaries of the work became the maximum distance 2 people could occupy and still keep each other in view, end quote. This intertwined relationship between movement, visibility, and topography would inform Serra's final composition. 6 slabs of poured concrete, each guided in direction and length by the shape of the land. Beginning at the 2 extreme points of distance set out by his and Jonas's movement around the field, Serra erected walls in the direction of the most significant drop in elevation in the land, extending each wall until this vertical drop reached a height of 5 feet, subsequent walls being set out through the same process. Varying in length and direction, the three walls on each side of the field meander towards the three walls on the other, meeting in an open space in the center. Now, rather than continuing to delve any deeper into the details of shift at this point, I'd like to pull back to a broader view, to begin to think about how it touches upon three issues of particular relevance for environmental art: site specificity, phenomenology, and agency. Issues that I'll address in sequence, and as we'll see, with an increasingly speculative cast as we move along. In doing so, the underlying question that I hope to approach is how art historians might address the ecological condition of artworks, where we might think of any painting in the collection of this museum in which we have all gathered to be just as validly situated ecologically as any outdoor earthwork. The latter does not hold any claim over the former as to being more or less environmental. Instead, the reason that I'm turning once again to an outdoor site-specific sculpture as means to articulate an approach to ecological art history is that its condition as such is affected far more intensely over time than a painting or sculpture kept in a climate-controlled gallery. In other words, outdoor works disclose the impact of their ecological situatedness more plainly and expediently than a Piero or a Cassatt, a point that I plan to get at by starting with the familiar reading of shift and moving into one that will be, I think, a little less so. We begin, therefore, with site specificity. This term emerged with the first wave of land art dating from the late 1960s, as popularly disseminated through Robert Smithson's distinction of a site as the sole place in which an artist works or in which an artwork was made to exist, and a non-site as the portable objects, photographs, texts, and so forth that can be displayed any place wherever. This original notion of site specificity was considerably reinforced by the controversy in the 1980s surrounding Serra's own sculpture, Tilted Arc, in New York City, a work ordered to be removed from its site despite the artist's testimony in a public hearing that moving the sculptural element of Tilted Arc was tantamount to destroying the work as a whole. Following this episode, critics began to identify a new kind of site-specific artwork, exemplified by artists such as René Green and Mark Dion, giving rise to a conception of site specificity tied less to place than to discourse. In a 1995 essay titled The Functional Site, from which I've spun the title of my own talk, James Meyer described the second wave of site specificity as, quote, an operation occurring between sites, a mapping of institutional and textual filiations. Mi-Wan Kwan would soon provide the most definitive account of these emergent practices in her 2002 book, One Place After Another, casting their relation into place as, quote, a discursively determined site that is delineated as a field of knowledge, intellectual exchange, or cultural debate. While both of these important arguments open new horizons for thinking about site-specific art, they have also had the effect of reinforcing an assumption that the outdoor sculpture of the early 1970s, created by Serra and others, should remain bound within the terms of first-wave site specificity, a reading that draws heavily both from Serra's own interpretation of shift as an object that mediates the scale of its site for an ambulatory spectator, and from a phenomenological interpretation of sight founded on the primacy of direct perceptual experience between subject and object. Such a reading applies as equally to shift as to other pioneering works of site-specific land art, including Michael Heiser's Double Negative and Smithson's Spiral Jetty. And if the slide comparison between shift and these other works looks familiar, as I'm sure it does to many of you, this might be because Rosalind Krauss chose all three to conclude her 1977 book, Passages in Modern Sculpture, by advancing a phenomenological reading of the relationship between these outdoor works and their spectator. Here's Krauss at the end of that book. Contemporary sculpture is indeed obsessed with the idea of passage. We find it in Serra's Shift, in Smithson's Jetty, and with these images of passage, the transformation of sculpture from a static, idealized medium to a temporal and material one that had begun with Rodin is fully achieved. In every case, the image of passage serves to place both viewer and artist before the work and the world in an attitude of primary humility in order to encounter the deep reciprocity between himself and it. We might recall that this phenomenological reading of site-specific outdoor sculpture was itself adopted from the impact of Maurice Merleau-Ponty on the art and criticism of minimalism during the previous decade, for which Krauss was herself a key voice. Looking at the actual pages themselves that conclude passages in modern sculpture, we might further note that all the images called upon to illustrate Krauss's point are photographs by Gorgoni, and all feature one or two isolated figures, encountering these works in the manner dramatized by her argument. Taken together, these photographs intimate an abstraction from time and place that is also central to the photograph of shift with which I began. This is to say that while the initial reception of shift was largely established around temporal experience via phenomenology, there is something nonetheless deeply atemporal about this interpretation, meaning that when viewed as a work of art, the object of experience is pulled forth from out of the continuous duration of its everyday existence and into an abstracted encounter with the perceptive faculties of its spectator. To further unfold this point, we might consider Krauss's next major treatment of shift in a catalog essay for Serra's first MoMA retrospective of 1986. Here she writes more specifically of this work, quote, "Moving over the grounds of the work, one experiences the walls as elements in constant transformation, first as line, then as barrier, only to become lines once more. Felt as barrier rather than as perspective, they then heighten the experience of the physical place of one's body. Without depicting anything specific, the wall's oscillation between the linear and physical articulates both a situation and a lived perspective. And it does this in the most abstract way possible, by the rotation in and out of depth of a plane." The next paragraph of this essay goes on to discuss Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology of perception, further explicating shift as a, quote, "external horizon through which the human body articulates its connection back and forth to horizons that lay beyond it. With respect to temporality, the point I wish to underscore here is that duration is central to Krauss's phenomenological framework, but only by way of the experience time of the active, perceptive subject, who must be present and in direct chiasmic relation to the work of art. Likewise, her vivid account of line and plane in the 1986 MoMA catalog jibes perfectly well with the presentation of shift in Gorgoni's photographs of the early 70s, but less so with the larger cycles of time that affect the condition and appearance of the work throughout the agricultural year, and moreover, amidst numerous factors that have reshaped King City during the last 4 decades. The environment surrounding and containing shift has in fact changed considerably since 1972, primarily because shift and its parcel of land are owned by the Toronto-based development company Hickory Hill Investments, having been purchased by this company from the original patron, Roger Davidson, when he sold his farmland in 1974, so very soon after the completion of the work. The presence of shift in Davidson's sale of land was then entirely ignored by Hickory Hill for about 30 years, until 2004, when members of King's City Council moved to register the artwork as a provincial heritage site. Around that same time, Hickory Hill had begun to actively build both condominiums and single-family homes on its real estate holdings in King City, altering, in the span of a few short years, the demographics of the town from a small, rural agricultural community to an exurb connected by commuter rail to Toronto. While rapid alterations to both the terrain and demographics of King City generated uncertainty about the future of shift, Hickory Hill staunchly resisted attempts to legally protect Serra's sculpture and site, claiming any such designation, quote, "inappropriate and unnecessary for a private piece of art on private property, already protected ecologically by the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Act." The illogical sleight of hand in this claim regarding the Oak Ridges Act of 2001 is strikingly similar to the sophistry applied to the concept of site specificity by federal administrators in the case of Tilted Arc. But unlike the outcome of that previous ordeal, in February 2013, Hickory Hill lost its argument, as Shift's 4 hectares of land were conferred cultural heritage value under the Ontario Heritage Act. But rather than securing the long-term preservation of Serra's work, I would argue, these recent proceedings only serve to further cloud the condition of Shift as an ecological site. In saying this, I don't mean to diminish the important preservation work accomplished on behalf of Shift. No one who cares about culture wants to see a bulldozer anywhere near Serra's work. However, this doesn't mean that we can simply pretend the site hasn't been transformed already since Shift was completed, by which I refer not only to the real estate development of King City, but also to changes in climate and attending local effects on plant life and the population of animals and insects. This site had in fact already been significantly on the move prior to Serra and Jonas's arrival. a topic which easily could be its own paper, but very briefly, the edging of trees around the field on which Shift is located is a reminder that this land used to be entirely forested, managed by indigenous hunting and forestry practices, which were irrevocably altered in the 19th century when forests were removed by European colonists to farm the land. Numerous local species disappeared from King Township, many of which have been reintroduced through the activities of Canadian conservation since the completion of Shift. All while the migratory patterns of these and other local species, in addition, of course, to the intensity and duration of weather patterns in the area, continued to be noticeably affected by climate change on a more global scale. Yet, while both large and small-scale developments have undoubtedly altered the place that Richard Serra and Joan Jonas walked in 1970, their sum effect does less to dissipate the specificity of Shift's site, I maintain, than to further implicate it within the effects of ecological succession over time. In other words, the approach to ecological site specificity that I'm proposing does not arise through a response to a new kind of contemporary art, so much as a new approach to understanding the persistence of existing artworks in sites beyond the time of their initial reception. Where unlike a more conventional historiography, I'm not proposing to think only about the discursive responses to site specificity over time, but to the interface of that discourse with the more unpredictable and material changes in the environment of the site-specific work of art. Which brings us back to the aesthetics of phenomenology and Shift's own reception. The phenomenological tradition in philosophy has in fact played a vital role not only in the interpretation of late 20th century sculpture, but also in the American tradition of environmental thought. Indeed, we might well imagine the appeal, particularly in Merleau-Ponty's late unfinished work, The Visible and the Invisible, of the entwining between subjecthood and objecthood as a compelling approach to getting beyond a human-centered view of the world and adopting one more ethically dispersed among the Earth's population of both living and non-living beings. Conversely, the limitation of this approach lies in the idea that a human subject still anchors the operation of phenomenological awareness. That although this subject comes to experience an immersion in the creative material flesh of the world beyond the membrane of selfhood, the individual person nonetheless retains a vestige of primacy in this model as the point from which this process originates. For instance, Rosalind Krauss's particular version of phenomenology carried forward from minimalism a strong notion of the chiasmus between the viewing subject and the artistic object, but in a manner that, as I have claimed throughout this talk, ultimately resists absorption into a more broadly ecological perspective that might break loose from the anthropomorphic anchors of Gorgoni's photographs, Serra's personal statements, and the abstraction of a living environment as pure space and time. As has been argued more recently by Jane Bennett and Diana Kuhl, among others, there is an alternate reading of Merleau-Ponty one might pursue that insists less upon phenomenology as a process rooted in the experience of abstraction by a human subject than as a means to realize a more distributed idea of the modes of agency that affect the generative forces of the world's material being. Or, in Kuhl's words, that, quote, Merleau-Ponty helps us to rethink agency, not as an essential characteristic of the rational subject, a deity, or some vital force, but as those contingent capacities for reflexivity, creative disclosure, and transformation that emerge hazardously within the folds and reversals of material, meaningful flesh. There, of course, has been much ink spilled in the wake of the scholarly turn to, quote, new materialisms in the last decade, some of it more welcome than others. My invocation of Bennett's Vibrant Matter and Kuhl's co-edited New Materialisms volume in this context is not to side with one camp or another in this multi-sided debate. The insight to be gathered from thinking through the implications of shift as a work of ecological site specificity instead reveals the fallacy or false appeal of landing upon any one explanatory framework as means of addressing the intersection of art and ecology as a living, durational exchange over time. To visualize this claim, I'd like to close by introducing what we see here as a kind of counter diagram. Counter because it is not meant to illustrate how things are, but how they are not or should not be abstracted. My own speculative assertion is that the work of art understood ecologically exists between the four poles before us, viewed entirely as an object devoid of human agency at the base of the vertical axis, and we slip into the tendency of some object-oriented ontology to elide human rights and institutionally entrenched forms of bias and discrimination, whether of gender, sexual orientation, race, or nationality, a critique that has been leveled forcefully and convincingly. Viewed with too much credence given to the intentions of human agency, either in the creation of an artwork or in the determination of how it persists in the world, and we get locked into the fallacy that the materiality of art ultimately exists within and for human subjectivity. A similar spectrum exists for the continuity of ecosystems along the horizontal axis. All stability, and we find ourselves in the worldview of 1968, whose whole Earth version of ecology was akin to a mainframe computer that could be programmed and controlled for predictable outcomes in both the short and long runs of time. All chaos or lack of stability, and we find ourselves in the purview of the apocalyptic futurist who can see nothing outside of complete ecological collapse. In addition, to admit that ecological processes are always in motion and that objects assert forms of control over their environment in concert with the efforts of other agents in those environments means that the kind of ecological sites in which works such as Richard Serra's Shift exist don't simply keep these various extremities engaged in a space of a constantly negotiated middle ground, but do so over an extended period of time, the crucial z-axis here, that insists that any one configuration is never permanent nor can ever be so. So, to read this approach through these two local examples of oil on panel and pastel on paper that I invoked earlier, both objects currently exist within a combination of a very stable ecosystem in this museum environment in concert with the relative stability of their artistic media, a stability that we might imagine continuing into the foreseeable future, but you never know. We don't know what's in the mind of the Clark's system of climate control or in store for the world's ever more intensive weather patterns. Whatever the future might hold in the relationship between these works and their environment, however, they are not specific to their current site. There might be a Cassatt retrospective someplace soon that would necessitate a road trip. In comparison, by articulating the ecological situatedness of Shift to its site in King City, I hope to have shown that, first, every work of art is informed by its present ecological conditions. And while not limited only to art located outdoors, the volatility of these latter objects offers points of entry for thinking about the ecological conditions of artworks conceived more generally. My second argument, developed in large part through art-critical phenomenology, has sought to pinpoint the ecological considerations of site-specific art, to stress that such considerations compel an expansion of the existing terms of site specificity from both its first and second waves. And as a final note, I realize that invoking an expanded purview for site-specific art no doubt calls to mind another diagram, that which we see here from Rosalind Krauss's influential 1979 essay, Sculpture in the Expanded Field. But the difference between the two grids before us, I maintain, is that the Klein group on the right provides a means of locking works of art into a place premeditated by discourse. That on the left asks us to allow for the deep-seated, not entirely human flux inherent in the duration of experiencing the work of art as an ecological phenomenon, insisting on specificity as a variable, living and non-living, multidimensional enterprise. Thank you.
Dr. Jessica Horton, yes, who is Assistant Professor of Art History, Modern, Contemporary, and Native American, I believe, at the University of Delaware. Can you remind us of the title of your very hot off the presses book, 2017 off the presses, so scorching? Okay. Art for an Undivided Earth. Look for it from Duke University Press, yes? Okay, so apologize for that, but thank you for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Dr. Horton. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I wanted to begin by proposing a potential cover image for the forthcoming conference proceedings, a work of eco-art and bovine modernism, perhaps, site-specific, encountered on these premises yesterday. Christopher and Rebecca can contact me about image permissions. And a very warm thank you to Christopher, Rebecca, and all of the conference organizers for including me in this conversation in this beautiful place. And I also want to, from the outset, express my thanks and my debt to the artist Arthur Amiot for his own research on the work of his great-grandfather Standing Bear and his support of my own ongoing process of learning from the object that I'm going to share with you today. In 2012, the Sydney Biennale featured a Lakota prayer as its title. All Our Relations is a translation of Mitakuye Oyasin, a humble Lakota prayer in which humans, animals, plants, rivers, mountains, and other beings are referenced as common kin in a framework of reciprocity. The artistic co-directors, Plains Cree artist and curator Gerald McMaster of the Tzitzika First Nation and Dutch curator Catherine de Zegger, strove to transform the Biennale biennial format into a model of planetary interconnectedness. Theirs was a vision, I think, consonant with the broader eco-cultural turn that has brought us together today. The curators urged, and I'll be quoting much of their own language here, moving on from a century defined by separation, negativity, and disruption as strategies of change. And they were especially critical of the default criticality they saw at work in much 20th century cultural production. And in fact, they quote Bruno Latour saying, "Critique is past." The curators instead emphasized that inclusionary practices of generative thinking, such as collaboration, conversation, and compassion, were urgently needed to compose a common world. And their exhibition incorporated an unprecedented number of Indigenous artists and collectives from the Americas and Australia, alongside the work of sympathetic global peers. Yet the phrase "all our relations," appearing only in English, often on celebratory streamers, floated curiously free from the particular history it had survived. One of US treaty breaking and state-sponsored violence against people and land, ongoing struggles for decolonization, and cultural renewal against the odds. In contrast to popular pronouncements of frontier closure that had opened a previous century, the people of Oceti-Sakowin, the 7 bands of Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota peoples who form the Great Sioux Nation, continued to prey in a colonial present. In the fall of 2016, another Lakota phrase moved and mobilized, Mini Wichoni, expresses respect for the vital connection between human bodies and the liquid veins of Unchimaka, Grandmother Earth. And widely translated, as I'm sure you're all very familiar, as "water is life," these words traveled far from Standing Rock in North Dakota, where members and allies of Oceti-Sakowin first set up camp in opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline the previous spring. And as you can see here, crowds from San Francisco all the way to Tokyo embraced this concise cosmopolitical alternative to the devastating colonial capitalist logic of extraction, one driving not only a pipeline invasion, but the neoliberal lockdown of the planet. And I'll be referring to this broad mobilization by its popular acronym, NODAPL. Close to my own home in Philadelphia, more than 60 members of the Jewish community wove the words into the Hebrew verses of the Waters of Babylon, and they continued to sing while 9 were arrested during a peaceful sit-in at banks funding the pipeline. So the translation of an Indigenous prayer into ecological revelation for all has clearly, unquestionably inspired impressive acts of solidarity around the globe. And I myself speak today from the position of a white settler ally, art historian, and being made of water, who has been galvanized, like so many, by NODAPL's proliferating words and images. Yet the 2 cases that I've briefly outlined here raise questions about all our responsibility to history. Questions that I think bind ethical activism to the development of an art history attentive to Indigenous and environmental justice in the 21st century. How might the ecological webs we spin incorporate, rather than obfuscate, violent dislocations that are in fact a strong connection to the past? What kind of eco-critical art history might we compose to multiply confront, critique, and cross traumatic divisions engendered by settler colonialism, a process out of which our discipline was forged and with which it remains complicit? And I should say, of course, that questions of this scale, echoing Rebecca this morning, right, are only ever prompts for further discussion. And on that note, in addition to the whole remainder of the conference, I'm really looking forward to Dylan Miner's talk this afternoon about contemporary Indigenous art and activism. I want to spend the remainder of my own talk with an object that I've selected from a vast archive of late 19th century Plains graphic arts. And there is already a large and multivocal literature on this topic that I'm citing. My own approach is merely to consider one distinct entity as a mirror for No Dapple, one that keeps this longer history of struggle in view, and as a potential teacher in relation to the art historical challenges I've highlighted. Around the year 1899, the Minneconjou Lakota man Standing Bear created this pictorial account of the events leading up to and including the Battle of the Little Bighorn of 1876. The images were drawn in pencil and painted with watercolor on a roughly 6-foot square of muslin. The work condenses multiple episodes of ceremony and battle drawn from the artist's memory and in conversation with his Oglala Lakota peers. It is a material distillation of the broad upheavals, human and other than human, that were occurring during the artist's lifetime. And here I think we could think about the work of art as an ecological object, to borrow a phrase from Jamie's first book. And like so many others at this conference, I'm using ecology in its expanded contemporary sense as the entanglement of cultural, political, technological, and so-called natural forces. And I fully acknowledge this is an anachronism, right? This is not, as we learned this morning, not what ecology meant when it was first coined during Standing Bear's lifetime. Here, the muslin's objecthood is further complicated by indigenous philosophies and protocols that are described by Sherry Farrell-Rissett. It possesses its own life force and is capable of nudging memory, calling forth a story. And finally, with a gaze calibrated by No Dapple's own proliferating archive of prayer and sometimes images that conjure a battlefield, we can better see, I think, how Standing Bear's work anticipates a future, modeling the survival of the people through a potent blend of embodied resistance, spiritual renewal, and history-telling or storytelling that is as pressing in the time of No Dapple as it was during Standing Bear's own life. And here my retrospective efforts are prompted by a number of scholars, activists, and artists who have insisted already on an historical approach to No Dapple, one that emphasizes continuity, particularly with the events of Indian removal. The Sakanga Lakota historian Nick Estes, for one, has argued, like our ancestors' wars of the 19th century, our current war is also defensive. It is to protect water and land from inevitable spoliation in the name of profit. And he was among those who contributed in the fall of 2016 to the hashtag Standing Rock syllabus, a really extraordinary online resource that I was very grateful to be able to use this year in my teaching. And it opens with this map, a map that relates the episodic history of Oceti-Sakowin dispossession to the path of the Dakota Access Pipeline, shown in red on the diagonal there. Gradations from light gray to black indicate the shrinking legal boundaries of native land due to treaties that the US government negotiated and then systematically violated since 1851. And of particular importance to the story I'm telling today, in 1874, General George Armstrong Custer supervised the largest of the 19th century federal surveys to both map and photograph and in other ways document Western topographies for the purposes of military and industrial expansion. And you'll all know this history well, I'm sure. He enthusiastically reports gold in the Black Hills of present-day South Dakota, which is a sacred center to the people of Oceti-Sakowin and was protected from incursions in the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868. Bowing to public pressure, President Grant canceled or attempted to cancel treaty obligations to Native nations in the Indian Appropriation Act of 1876 and annexed the coveted land for mining in the Black Hills Act of 1877. So if you look at the map produced during Custer's trip, you can see that the sort of backbone at the center of the map there aligns roughly with the section of the outline of the current contemporary state of South Dakota, which the pale gray section, medium gray section, I should say, represents the shifting boundaries of the broken 1868 treaty. These actions, of course, foreshadow President Trump's executive green light on the contested final Dakota Access Permit in 2017, and so too did they set the stage for past and present acts of resistance. The great battle between U.S. cavalry, Lakota, Dakota, and allied Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho forces in the summer of 1876 occurred by the Little Bighorn River in Montana on land that Oceti-Sakowin Nation never actually relinquished to the United States. And likewise, you can see on this map how the Dakota Access Pipeline snakes for many miles across unceded territory, shown in palest gray. Born in 1859, Standing Bear bore intimate witness to the history abstracted on the Standing Rock syllabus map. When he was 17 years old, he took part in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and he witnessed the ceremonies that immediately preceded it. He was among the first Lakota to travel with Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, subsequently to Europe in 1887, and again in 1889 to 91. And it was while he was convalescing there from an injury that he lost his wife and possibly a daughter during the massacre of Wounded Knee in 1890. Standing Bear ended up marrying his nurse, a Viennese woman named Louise Rennick, and they settled among the Oglala of Pine Ridge Reservation. They participated in a new cash economy by farming, ranching, building caskets, and providing medical services for their community. And it was during this time that Standing Bear completed 4 known large-scale works on muslin, as well as countless drawings on paper before his death in 1933. And I'm just showing you here Arthur Amiot's sort of collage homage to his great-grandfather's artistic and spiritual and historical vision, not to mention a very clever pun on horsepower. His rendering of the battle, Standing Bear, that is, his rendering of the Battle of the Little Bighorn was likely commissioned by the white American artist Elbridge Ayer Burbank during his trip to paint portraits of the Lakota people in 1899. And the battle scene in particular continues a Plains graphic tradition in which men recorded events of individual bravery and collective importance on animal hide shirts, shields, drums, teepees, and historical records known as winter counts. More unusual is Standing Bear's choice to flank the battle scene with animal dreamer society dances, shown on the lower left, and a sun dance on the right, 2 ceremonies that immediately preceded the battle. Ceremonial images have no deep precedent in tribal annals. The art historian Janet Burlow has suggested that 3 commissioned drawings on paper by the Sanzark Lakota man Black Hawk around 1880 may be the first to depict the sun dance. And she attributes their appearance to a new autoethnographic impulse born of crisis on the plains. And here it's relevant to know that the first federal ban on sun dancing was issued in 1883. The official Code of Indian Offenses targeted a whole range of ceremonies that involved the redistribution of material goods throughout the community. And we can imagine that this is presumably because this violated a logic of private capitalist accumulation that would increasingly define assimilation policy. Lakota people nonetheless continued to dance and gift covertly, and Standing Bear's family in particular was known for their generous feasts and gift giving. The shift from hide to cloth and paper in the 19th century marked another site of negotiation between two markedly different systems of valuing a beyond human world. Skins were more than a dead ground on which anthropocentric histories were inscribed. Animals were spiritual intermediaries in the events whose memories they hosted. Given their importance to every aspect of Plains cultures, the Kiowa artist and author N. Scott Momaday has likened the US government's orchestrated decimation of buffalo as a deicide. So whether by choice or by necessity, artists who replaced the uneven contours of animal bodies with neat rectangles of manufactured paper or cloth were on some level participating in a capitalist revaluation of their environments. And indeed, many of Standing Bear's own works left the reservation entirely, sold for needed cash to traders, tourists, or collectors like Burbank. Yet his daughter, Christina Standing Bear, in interviews with Amiot, recalls that his process first involved hosting communal gatherings in the family's wood frame cabin. The furniture would be pushed aside, and guests would sit on the floor, smoking pipes and enjoying a feast, while the artist unrolled his yet unfinished artwork. A process of verification and storytelling among his age mates would continue late into the night. The art historian Marilee Janser White has stressed that meanings were crafted in a nexus of relationships that stressed both pictorial and oral components. And I think that the visual dimensions of the completed artwork also powerfully reframe any unilateral narrative of, say, frontier closure or cultural assimilation. The animal dreamer society dances that took place occurred during a multi-tribal gathering on the Rosebud River prior to battle. And here, sacred powers bestowed on humans by animal guardians who visited them in dreams were publicly displayed and tested. We see 4 black-tailed deer and elk dreamers carrying sacred hoops, circles which concentrate the power of everything that is wakan or sacred, as expressed in the Lakota phrase wakan tanka, which very crudely and overly simplistically, I think, translates as the great mysterious. An elk dreamer raises a hoop with a mirror at center, a mirror that reflects the bright light and the power of the sun, chief of Wakan Tanka, in order to deflect harm that is aimed at him during this ceremony of testing. And just keep that sort of mirrored hoop in mind as I will come back to it later in my talk. Eagle feathers, horns, and star and cloud symbols adorn the dreamers' headdresses. And these signs, gifted by guardian spirits, were reproduced on clothing and belongings as marks of personal distinction and protection against danger. This was a power that Standing Bear shows was tested again during the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And I don't have time to go into all the details of the 4 different scenes that Standing Bear has condensed here. The scholar Father Peter Powell has published a really excellent account of the kind of blow-by-blow here. I will say, however, that the famous last stand of Custer and his command is represented by those relatively ordered figures, the upright figures at the very top of the muslin. These flag-bearing cavalrymen are mainly distinguished from one another by their relative states of demise. And in contrast, Standing Bear lavishes detail on the decoration of indigenous persons and horses. Each is clothed in mystery and power. These tangible marks, in turn, alert us to the spiritual guardianship that bolstered human agency during the conflict. And I think, too, their active power, in turn, enlivens industrial cloth, as well as the social contexts from which the object calls forth stories. At the heart of the muslin, and perhaps at the matter, is a representation of the Sundance Lodge, a giant bower of tree branches, animal hides, teepee poles, with an entrance facing the sunrise. Sundance is held during 4 days at midsummer when Unchimaka, Grandmother Earth, has nurtured plants and animals to maturity. And Arthur Amiot, who himself is a ritual participant, his family was part of the sort of recreation of, reconnection to the sun dance in the latter part of the 20th century. I'm going to just quote him on the significance of the sun dance. He writes, "In the mythic beginning of the Lakota world, its sacred and temporal dimensions were one, and the Lakota still recognizes himself as a microcosmic reflection of that macrocosm. If he can live in concert with the holy rhythm of that which causes all life to move, he is then assisting in the ongoing process of creation. To maintain his participation in this process, he needs annually to make the journey to the center of the world, which is the place of his beginning and the origin of all things. There he can renew his relation with the sacred rhythm in the ceremony known as the sun dance." And this particular event of 1876 was hosted by the famous Hunkpapa Lakota chief and leader of the resistance Sitting Bull, who was pictured to the far right with his a white horse in full regalia. And he's preparing to offer a sacrifice of flesh and blood to the sun. There are two other men as well, shown attached by the flesh of their chest to a central pole made of a felled cottonwood tree. Sometimes denigrated by colonizers as a form of torture, this act of giving flesh and blood joins human to tree and sun, earth and sky in a recapitulation of Lakota origins. And in fact, it's while dancing with bloodied arms that summer that Sitting Bull received a prophetic vision of blue-coated soldiers raining from the sky. And again, just to briefly go back here for a moment, Standing Bear shows that this premonition was fulfilled during the battle as soldiers cascade downhill, or perhaps given the absence of a visible topography here from the sky. The Sundance Lodge Circle, a place of origin and return, guides the rest of the composition. Circles are repeated in the teepee camp, in dreamers' hoops, in warriors' shields, and together they recall the mnemonic device of the winter count, a kind of Lakota calendar also meant to prompt oral recounting, in which pictographic representations of a single important event of each year are arranged in a spiral. Likewise, annual journeys back to the center pattern a nonlinear temporality. And Standing Bear also, I think, shows us how ceremony powerfully affects human history and its retelling. So just to summarize the components he's brought together here, Animal Dreamers dances legitimized individual gifts of spiritual guardianship. The sun dance renewed collective relations to earth and sky and foretold victory. And finally, the battle brought these regenerative and protective forces to bear on a crucial historical political juncture. And what about Mini Wichoni, Water is Life? I'm going to stay here for a second. Viewers accustomed to a Western landscape tradition will be struck, as I've already suggested, by the near lack of topographic detail. Notably absent is that all-important horizon line, right? That compositional element that grants viewers a sense of mastery over a pictured terrain. Only the sinuous parallel lines of the Rosebud and Little Bighorn rivers seem to stand in here for physical land. In fact, it looks to me like the normal position of a horizon line has actually been replaced here by a river. Comparing their shape to a contemporaneous map that Standing Bear drew of the battlefield, it's clue that while he was well aware of the geographical conventions of Western mapmaking, this did not interest him here. This is neither a landscape nor a map. Laniko Lee of the Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota Oak Lake Writers Society has described rivers as earth arteries, life-giving and healing forces that course through Unchimaka, Grandmother Earth. And she writes, they're part of a larger expression of our relationship to everything that is. In Standing Bear's work, they're also a dynamic element that counters the static leanings of a square cloth. They provide a secondary organic frame around the Sundance Lodge, creating lines of energy that course to the edges of the muslin. And rivers here are also boundaries that he's using to demarcate and unite episodes of ceremony and battle into a compositional and spiritual whole. Here, the prayer of interconnectedness, Mitakuye Oyasin, or all our relations, does not transcend the violent conflicts of Indian removal. It rather provides a powerful framework for affecting, interpreting, and ultimately withstanding surviving colonial ruptures that were then, as they are now, unfinished. In the fall of 2016, Chanupahanska Luger, a member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, who was born at Standing Rock and is one of the founding members of the Winter Count Artists Collective, distributed these mirrored shields made out of masonite and foil to water protectors on the Nodapal front lines. They reflected back lines of militarized North Dakota police who appeared like historical reenactors in their own frontier drama, aiming rubber bullets as though to reprise the actions of cavalrymen who advanced across the land before them. Luger's mirrored shields captured a real-time image of colonial violence unfolding again on the plains. But as we can see here, they also concentrated the light and the power of the sun to deflect it. And in this, I think Standing Bear's prayerful battlefield and Luger's protective armature reflect one another. Thanks. Should I leave that up?
Truly, yeah, it's apt. I'll kick it off with just a question that I had in listening to both your really tremendous papers about some terms and some shared terms and also some terms that distinguish your kind of approach to your very different but connected material. And one term was life force. You used it in speaking about the Standing Bear muslin and the work of art presenting its own kind of life force. And you spoke about agency and that being the sort of third approach by which a work like Shift can be sort of reconfigured in a new understanding of ecology. I just wanted to maybe ask you to think about those two terms, press upon them a little more in regards to how you think about your own projects. Is there a difference between life force and agency, especially in this kind of more socially embedded consideration of what ecology might be and how it is a sort of product and a producer of past colonial violence and neo-colonial capitalist violence of all kinds? I mean, just wanted to throw those terms out there since they both appeared, and I feel like they both have reasons to be spoken about a little more, picked apart a little more, if that's of interest to you, life force and agency in these works.
I think that's a bit of a tricky question in the field of Indigenous art histories because of the way in which incredibly complicated concepts of other than human, and I kind of like to use that phrase that circulates sometimes through our field, as opposed to non-human, because it maybe holds in place some more potentially complex field of agencies, life forces that that the non-human sort of, reifies this kind of human, non-human binary, right? But I feel like it's always an uncomfortable matter trying to settle on one of these terms because they are such imprecise concepts for translating complex worldviews. But I like life force. I mean, they're both used constantly in my field, I would say. I like life force in this case in particular because we're talking about the ways in which.
Can't hear you.
Oh, you can't hear?
No.
Oh my goodness. Hello. Sorry about that.
Should we do a brief recap? Could you hear most of that? Okay.
I was talking about the problems of translating complex Indigenous concepts and cultural worldviews into English pithy phrases like agency or life force, none of which I think are quite right or accurate, but both are used at different times in my field. And I like life force in particular because the sort of understanding of the way that energy moves through the Lakota universe is there's a sort of finite amount of energy in the world, but it is translatable and moves between different bodies in a kind of larger system of reciprocity and exchange. That term, all our relations, perhaps gets at a bit, again, an imprecise translation, whereas agency, we have come to talk about the agency even of dead things, things understood to be wholly objectified in the human world, right? And so life force, I think, reanimates all of those things that are potentially treated as dead in a sort of colonial Western framework. So,
to try and add to that, I guess, a bit. I mean, it's a difficult question.
Yeah.
I'd say that, I mean, I feel similarly to Jess that I don't have a succinct way, I think, to respond to that, but I will say that, thinking about addressing these problems through a kind of working process, it's been a great opportunity working on the paper for this conference, being that part of the thematic of the conference is agency. Because I think, like many of us in this room, I read Vibrant Matter when it was first published a number of years ago and thought, like, yes, this is a really exciting approach for thinking about art history, and then ran into a bit of a stumbling block in thinking about how that actually would get worked out methodologically. And as I sit here and think about it out loud now, I realize that more or less coincides with the same period I was also visiting Shift and thinking about it in terms of what was happening in town and being interested and engaged with the work, but also not quite knowing how I wanted to address it art historically. And in sort of thinking about these terms under the heading of this conference, I had a chance to go back and reread Vibrant Matter, and one of the things that struck me and that I think maybe mobilized what I was articulating in my paper just now is that while there is a historical dimension to that text, say genealogically, the philosophical presence of numerous texts sort of speaking to each other across hundreds and in a couple cases thousands of years in that book, nonetheless doesn't really provide a historical framework for Vibrant Matter. It's as if that genealogy of text arrives at the present day to address whatever configuration of agents happens to be in that environment at that precise moment. And so it struck me that thinking about ecological succession as something that might lend itself to more of a historical approach to thinking about new materialism is a way to get at agency, where something like Shift is both being acted upon by various political constituencies, by this real estate corporation, but and is itself non-living in the sense that it's poured concrete, but yet it also affects its environment in really kind of minor ways, that there is more ecological diversity in that field because of the presence of those walls. You could see it in the spring photographs. There's all sorts of plant life that grows around that work that they don't cut into. And furthermore, that the fact that it's a working field has been altered from the moment of its creation as a potato field to a cornfield, which is a seemingly simple shift, but it does nonetheless impact the way that it both is available to experience as a work of art and the way that it pushes back in terms of local legislative demands in the community.
If I can I add something to your point about Vibrant Matter or the sort of new materialisms, something I've thought about a lot as well, and I've thought about it, and many others have written about it as well in terms of sort of quiet forms of indigenous appropriation or something like that, but I've kind of come to think about this differently in terms of how blunted are our collective intellectual tools for addressing the current crisis or rupture, whatever we want to call the sort of current situation of global climate change, if we embrace, the sort of philosophical dimensions of something like All Our Relations, but somehow sever that from the histories of dispossession and decolonization struggles through which they have passed and by which they have arrived in this present moment, right? That actually it's the richness of these, richness is a too positive of a term, but it's precisely how these things have passed through violent histories to arrive in a very violent present that actually make them politically potent, part of a politically potent conversation, right? And that we lose that. We lose both their political dimensions when we lose their historical dimensions. So.
Yeah, well put. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for two really fascinating papers. My question's for Jessica, actually, and it relates to taking us back to that Sydney Biennale and the All Our Relations, that sort of disengaged. Thank you for reconnecting that back to very specific geography and violent colonial history. My question is actually, I remember as part of that Biennale, Bruno Latour's work was published in the catalogue, and I'm curious about the utility or otherwise of the kind of network relations that his actor network theory provides, and also that Biennale and many of those Sydney Biennales have been crucial modes for networking for Indigenous peoples from Australia, Indigenous artists from Australia with Indigenous artists from America and elsewhere. And I just wondered about bringing it back to its own violent local history is crucial, but there's also a history of network relations between Indigenous communities internationally that I think also perhaps need to be part of this conversation.
Sure, yeah, I completely agree. And what was interesting about that particular biennial is that despite the artistic director's sort of framing of this as a kind of post-critical version of a framework of interconnectedness, actually the artworks included in it spoke to much different and much more sort of pressing historical divisions. The work I showed you by the Artists Collective Post Commodity, a group of Indigenous practitioners from primarily from the American Southwest, they actually cut a hole in the floor of the Art Gallery of New South Wales to expose the land beneath, and mic'd in a collaborative sound of Aboriginal, urban, displaced Sydney Aboriginal people singing and storytelling. So it was a work of collaboration that made a kind of intervention that both conjures historical violence of colonial omission, right? The kind of building of an art museum that makes invisible the histories of land on which it sits, and did so in a kind of framework of solidarity. And I think probably the most interesting legacy of that biennial isn't the catalog, but it's the kind of relationships among Indigenous artists that have been incredibly rich and growing around the Pacific Rim, in particular, that far outlived the biennial, and in some ways spoke to a different history than the particular way it was framed.
I have a question about that particular biennial, actually, and it overlaps with issues of assimilation and cultural appropriation that you touched on briefly, and I really thought you had a great paper and really interesting presentation. But as a Canadian with an Indigenous background, I've always thought of Gerald McMaster as a very distinctly Canadian artist. So to see him emerge as a curator of an Indigenous festival taking place in Australia that included American artists and Australian artists and spoke about Indigenous issues in that cultural context, I'm just finding it really hard to sort of grasp the whole shape of this, because to me that feels like it's sort of been, I know you know what I'm talking about because I know you got this background, but it feels pulled out of its own shape You know, it feels like very much pulled out of its own shape, especially given that the system of oppression in Australia was modeled on the Canadian system, not the American system. So I wonder about that dialogue and if it had any impact on how the Biennale was perceived, or what the repercussions were, or the dialogues that happened, and if anyone has brought up these issues of cultural appropriation and assimilation. And, you know, speaking as a woman of mixed descent, assimilation is probably the #1 issue in Canada, because it was a deliberate philosophy. So, I mean, it was an actual policy. It was, I'm sure you know this, it was a practice. So to see this situation with this Canadian artist sort of swallowed into this amorphous Indigenous whole feels strange to me. And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, and it's an interesting puzzle, and I have spoken with McMaster about this particular biennial, and I know that the ultimate form of it came out of what was framed as the sort of collaborative conversation between him and De Zegher, who's a kind of international art star curator in her own right, and curated a subsequent, I can't remember now if it was Documenta or the Venice Biennial as well. So there were obviously two players and two voices entangled in the ultimate form. It's interesting that McMaster is the one quoting Latour, and De Zegher is the one who actually cites the Lakota prayer kind of deep into, it's the only citation in the catalog, sort of deep into the text. So it's a bit of a, what's that? Yes. Sorry. Yes. And so obviously he's someone who's enormously productive oeuvre, speaks to a very different version of Canadian history and First Nations oppression and all of that, and I have huge respect for that. It was strange to me that it was so absent in his own writing about this particular biennial. I do wonder if there's an enormous amount of pressure in sort of becoming a part of or being present within this biennial structure that has been so critiqued for its kind of leveling of, its sort of maybe presumptions to leveling differences among global artists, right? And at the same time, of course, is a very elite crowd of recycled voices and so on. And so McMaster was a really fresh and important presence there. But I think there's probably an enormous amount of pressure to not claim like sort of one's allegiance within that framework. I don't know, I'm feeling uncomfortable here because I don't want to speak obviously for him or what his intentions were with that biennial, while I do think that the critique stands in terms of how these materials circulated, freed of their particular histories. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and the biennial strove to do more than that, right? It set up these indigenous conversations, global indigenous conversations, but within a broader global contemporary art framework that all biennials take on some level or another, right? There sort of aims to be a snapshot. So, for me, I went into that biennial and experienced particular artworks far more powerfully than I did the whole. I don't even try to go to biennials to see everything or experience everything equally. And so I gave much more attention to, say, the work of the Mohawk artist Alan Michelson, or of Post-Commodities work, or Dorothy Napangardi, who I showed you on screen, an Aboriginal painter. My experience was one of tremendous artistic richness, and I did experience those dialogues happening, but primarily in the particular sites and interventions that occurred within the larger biennial framework.
Mm-hmm. Hi. James, may I ask you a question, please? It's something about the poetry of ruins, the phenomenology of ruins, that is lurking there behind, or maybe not even lurking behind, present in your third strategy for talking about what goes on in that field. I'd agree with you. Talking of walking the fields, I thought you were going to turn, maybe eventually you will, to the great trekking phenomenologist Heidegger, whose ideas are supposedly came from walking out in the wilds where he had his hut. But I wonder if a focus on this third strategy might not open the doors to us for a different kind of art historical writing. We've had the same kind of empirical writings, positivistic writings, figuring out causes, influences, and so on for the past 100 years. Now, when we come to talking about topics like ecologies, agents, terrains, are we also feeling the insistent pulse beat of a different kind of writing, perhaps more, excuse me, poetic writing, born of, it could be Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology, but is it something about, decay is too odious a word, but things falling into other states of being?
Thanks, Michael. There's a lot to think about there. Maybe I'll start with just a small anecdote on the topic of ruination, which is that part of the reason, apparently, and this is in the records of the city council meetings, that nothing happened at this site for so many years is because the investment firm thought Shift was a ruin. They didn't know it was a work of art, apparently, and thought it was the ruined walls left over from an earlier settlement in the town. So there is an actual sort of ruination story to Shift, but I think actually one of the images I pulled out at the last minute, because it would have put me well over time, was of the decay of the concrete as well, because I think that rather than, well, a couple things. One, I think that issues of conservation are particularly rich with respect to land art, and run the gamut of poles being replaced at the lightning fields so that it looks exactly like it looked in 1977, to Michael Heiser's double negative being allowed to crumble into the earth, despite the fact that the Heiser estate, or the Heiser studio doesn't permit the reproduction of those crumbling works in publications and presentations. There's really a kind of a wide variety, I think, of the degree to which erosion as a kind of ruination factors into this work. And I think rather than that just entering into conversations of conservation, I think it also opens up conversations about the way that these works can serve as a different kind of index to historical time and change. I mean, as someone who lives in a home built in 1920, I've been told that concrete from the early 20th century lasts about 100 years, and then I'm going to need a new foundation soon. Concrete from the later 20th century lasts longer, but in fact, under the conditions in which Shift has been photographed on an annual basis, allows us to see a kind of change taking place at that very kind of microscopic level of the surface of concrete, which doesn't quite address, though, your question about art historical writing. And it's something that I'm quite interested in, and I think that the degree to which our arguments, the degree to which the form of our writing should be motivated by the subjects that we address, the fallback position of the discipline to write 3 or 4 or 5 essays around a similar topic and put them together into the form of a book doesn't hold up, I think, within these much more expansive far-reaching both historically but also geographically and ecologically ways of dealing with our materials. And it does call forth, I think, a necessity to rethink the way that we put words to paper. And I think that I hear from what you're saying something may be happening both at the level of the sentence and also of the structure of a piece itself. I don't want to maybe share my own speculative thoughts about what directions this piece might take relative to my work, because it's very in code at this point. But I want to share sympathy with that point of view and agree that I think this, and not just either a new material or an ecological turn, but really the state of the field relative to the sheer number of issues that we're committed to, both in the present day and historically, I think necessitates experimentation and flexibility with how we write our work.
Okay.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, we're going to keep microphones here. I was going to add this actually, I think kind of follows. Also a question for James. And I came to the abstract question, so forgive me in advance. But I was I found very compelling your wish to try to think beyond a phenomenological take on environmental works and as a way of moving outside of a anthropocentric perspective. And the one thing I was thinking, though, is to speak in terms of the effect of the environment on the work in the ways that you were to open it that way, in some ways presumes that you already have the category of environment. And you can imagine the argument that says that to cast things in terms of those kind of doublets, the environment as against the work, or matter as against the human or phenomenological, that those categories are reinforcing each other. And I had the sense that there was a slightly different angle on what you were talking about, in that when you had that image talking about shifts in the environment, the photograph was showing the shifts in the environment, there are ways in which you can't, those shifts, whether you read them spatially or temporally, are only legible at all in relation to something like the marker provided by shift, by the work. And that suggests a slightly different version of what an ecological work is, not the work under the influence of an environment, but the work in relation to whatever mechanism it is that opens up those categories at all. Environment as against work, or matter as against human, and that's that gives a slightly different feel to that kind of wavering in the Sarah between the phenomenological character, that is its wall, and then the purely inscribed non-phenomenological feel of that becomes the measure of its being an ecological work. So if there's violence in that kind of inscribing, it's a violence that underwrites the production of those categories, like environment, like the human, like. So that's my.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's well put. And let me see if I follow you. If my understanding of how you're articulating that, and something that was implicit in my talk, but that I didn't spell out, is the way that, when I first encountered the field, it was in the middle of fall and the corn hadn't been harvested, and it was a shock to step in the field and realize that I couldn't actually see the sculpture, and that my way of wading into the piece was actually going to be far different than the idea I had of it from those Gorgoni photographs. Which is to say that with that kind of agricultural cycle, in addition to the kind of longer developmental cycle and even longer climatic cycle that is affecting the town, that we still experience shift. Shift is still a work to be experienced, but the way in which we experience it as sculpture, as a field, as a preserved site, meaning something different legally, as something that is circumscribed by historical developments in the early, mid, and late 20th centuries into the 21st, that all of those things can fluctuate on these different scales and allow, yes, if I capture what you're saying, allow kind of hinges, some of which can be quite violent and jarring between these registers of how we experience the work of art, that experience is still important, which is why I think phenomenology remains a useful category, but a phenomenology that we have to think of in quite different ways from that I articulated of the reception of minimalism up through site-specific land art.
Mm-hmm. I guess where I would qualify that a little bit, that even in, I think that's right, but even in that response, it's invoking time and cyclicalness as the kind of master term that lets us, and I guess what I'm suggesting is that there might be something in the work that gets at what produces the possibility of even those forms of categorization. I mean, time and cycles are also phenomenological categories. So that's where.
Yeah, and I will say, I mean, and that's well taken. The invocation of those sort of larger terms, I called them cycles a moment ago, is in part comes from the fact that I just haven't been able to get the data that I thought I'd be able to get about the work, which speaks to its own sort of research problem of, through all the published materials, both journals, books, through calling agencies in Ontario, I have yet to be able to get really specific information about what insects and how many of them I could expect to find in that field right now relative to what it would have looked like 10 years ago, 20 years ago, what birds would be flying overhead at certain months of the year relative to those time frames. And I think, and this opens up different avenues for art historical research, I think I need to go talk to farmers. I think a kind of living archive is also a part of this type of research project.
Jamie, can I just pick up on, I think, this, and also return to Michael's question earlier, which sort of points to an undercurrent that both you and Jessica began with, which I found really a strong part of your entire talk, was about documentation, which, of course, you never assume is transparent, but the kind of poetics of documentation that we have to have if we're going to have this model of a kind of the sensitivity to an ecological afterlife of earthworks, as opposed to, say, a cultural critical afterlife of earthworks. And again, so much of what I thought you were going to say was about that, the way that documentations of certain, of course, demands. And I love the literalism of reproducing the Krauss stuff as it is read. I mean, 'cause there's clearly a presence of that. But I do wonder how much this relates to what Michael Ann is speaking about the actual materialities of art history. The processes, the literalisms of art history, not just supposed as kind of immaterial type of writing, but the actual means by which that writing exists in the world. And I mean in very real ways, a book, blah, 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 blah. But I just wondered if there's anything, both you and Jessica began with sort of, as it were, photo documentation of interior artworks. And so, any thoughts on that I would love.
Go ahead.
So first of all, thanks for noticing that. This is something that I've been also thinking about with this work. And I will say, just in terms of form, I don't usually show this many images in 20 minutes. I mean, my more typical approach might be to show far fewer things and home in on them much more closely. But I thought, part of what was implicit about the argument is the sort of changing face of the work and the sort of jarring contrast between the official documentary photographs of it and shots. Anything that was really pixelated, that was by me, and then things that were sort of sharper by local photographers. But something I have been thinking about in, prior to the Clark conference volume as one sort of endpoint for this project, is how a format like digital publishing might lend itself to shift in ways that are more appropriate to the work, I think, than a conventional essay or book, because there you have the ability to keep adding and editing images which fits into this argument about the changing nature of the work being expressed through a kind of community involvement of people who visit the work during different conditions and times of the year over time, being able to add their images to a kind of central site to be able to get this both longer view of the work, but also more multiple view of the work from the various viewpoints of the people who document it. One of the big sort of blocks against doing such a project, and it's an image that I also didn't show, is that the very last time that I went to the work was a couple of years ago. There was now a very large and secure metal fence, which doesn't prevent you from jumping it, but means that access to the work is now even more difficult than it previously had been, preventing a kind of ongoing documentation.
I don't know which particular document you were thinking about. There were a number of them in my talk, but...
You opened with the shit, the cow shit and the shit.
Oh yeah, oh the cow shit. I'm going to actually choose a different document to talk about, partly because it's one I'm still sort of grappling with and kind of trying to puzzle through, so it might be useful to throw out my uncertainties on stage in the hopes of a further dialogue. But you know, I flashed on screen when I was showing this Standing Rock syllabus map, which is a fascinating document, and of course I juxtaposed it with the reconnaissance map of the Black Hills that was produced from Custer's survey, and there's been so much literature, of course, about the way that maps are sort of bent to the ends of dominion, and they're sort of gridded division of land, perhaps being deeply linked to the actual material invasions and in that land. So the Standing Rock Sioux syllabus is such an interesting one because on the one hand it reintroduces this element of time to show us the episodic dispossession, but it's also a map. It is a tool of, we could say it is a tool of the colonial toolkit, right? And sort of how far could that go, right? So in some ways I was thinking about Standing Bear's muslin as certainly a document of its own sort, but when I spoke with Arthur Amiot about the rivers in his great-grandfather's work, he said to me, you know, my ancestors had mental maps that they carried with them wherever they went, and that was necessary to know where to camp and where to find adequate water supplies on journeys. And I was thinking about the mental map versus the sort of document, right? The static map that is kind of incontrovertible and stands for all time. That the mental map is something embodied and something a little bit more like the role that, say, the winter count plays as on the one hand, a calendar document, a historical document, but one that prompts a engagement with storytelling and with memory that sort of re-enlivens the document with some kind of relationality within the present. So I think I'm still grappling with the role of different kinds of documents. There was also, of course, photography of the Black Hills. I chose one with rivers in it that were, you know, partaking of a landscape tradition that also has a link to colonization and dispossession of the West. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.